All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johannes Urpalainen. I'm the Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Professor of Energy, Resources and Environment here at Johns Hopkins Heiss. And I'm also the founding director of our Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, or ISEP. Today's talk is from our new series. We have this series that is co-sponsored by ISEP and the Energy, Resources and Environment Program on research on these energy and environmental policy issues. And I'm very glad to welcome Rohit Chandra from Harvard Kennedy School, who is doing some truly remarkable work on the coal industry in India. I was speaking to Rohit earlier this morning, and his argument for writing on this topic is that the last good history of the coal industry in India was written in the early 1980s. Times have changed a little bit. The coal industry is facing some different challenges today than it was in 1983. So as a result of that, I think this is a very timely topic, and I'm really looking forward myself to learning all the ins and outs of this very important industry. Rohit has a book, manuscript on this topic. It's not published yet, but we do hope to be able to read the full argument with all the footnotes and references in, let's say, a year's time or so, if things go well. So Rohit, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. It's great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And so, as Johannes mentioned, my work focuses primarily on the Indian coal industry. And this is a glimpse of some of my dissertation work and also some arguments I'll make regarding why the coal industry might last longer than people are suspecting right now. And a lot of this is based on insight from about 18 months of field work I've done in India over the last 5-6 years. And so, yeah, let me get into it. So I'll go over my dissertation project in a little bit of detail just to give you a flavor of what I'm working on, and then give you a little bit of background about the industry and discuss 2 of the chapters of my dissertation, which focus on kind of the technical and financial changes of the Indian coal industry in the last 40 years. And then towards the end, I'll spend about 5-10 minutes discussing why I think coal will last in India much longer than people are suspecting right now, or given some of kind of the arguments that seem to be being made in kind of especially media outlets. So my dissertation focuses on this larger idea of adaptive state capitalism. And in particular in coal, Coal India as a company, which is kind of the monopoly entity that runs the coal industry in India, was formed in 1975, and it exists today. But what's happening under the hood is drastically different. And so the majority of my dissertation focuses on how the state-owned enterprise has actually changed over the last 40 years over kind of these different verticals. And so kind of the first 2 are about federal politics and labor politics. And the 2 I'll be discussing today, which I think this audience will find more interesting because it's not quite as India-specific, is kind of some of the technological and financial changes that have happened. So in many ways, I'm arguing in favor of coal and in favor of state capitalism. I'm on great footing already, I'm sure. So if you want to understand the coal industry, the 2 main institutions you need to understand in India are the Ministry of Coal, which is kind of the politically led, high-level decision-making body. And the one really unique thing about the Ministry of Coal is that it makes all the high-level allocations decisions for coal. So there is no real coal market in India as such. You can't buy a long-term supply of coal. You have to apply to the Ministry of Coal, and then they can allocate it to you. In the last 2-3 years with auctions, this has changed a little bit, but historically this has not been the case. And even the majority of coal allocations in India today are done through administrative, not market mechanisms. Currently, the coal and railway ministries are unified, and this leads to certain kinds of benefits, especially in kind of improving evacuation problems, which India has had historically. And I'll discuss that in a little bit. But the most important institution you need to focus on if you understand the Indian coal industry is Coal India Limited. So Coal India is a state-owned company run by the Ministry of Coal, and it produces about 85% of all coal in India today. And it focuses primarily on kind of the operational aspects. So policy decisions are left to the Ministry of Coal. Coal India is mainly an implementation and mining body. And it's distributed quite widely throughout India. At this moment in time, about 20% of Coal India is actually publicly traded, which may go up later this year given on kind of what we've heard in the budget. But it's still, the majority shareholding is by the government of India. And so they make most of the decisions for this company, which has led to some frictions, which I'll talk about as well. And so you can see that these 7 companies are distributed throughout India. And their structure is not quite so important, but their spatial spread is. So if you look at it, basically eastern and central India is where almost all of India's coal is. That red box accounts for over 95% of India's coal production. You can see some small fields in the west, in the northeast, but those aren't nearly as significant. So when we're talking about the coal belt in India, this kind of eastern region and central region is kind of the most important part. So just kind of a brief overview of how the coal industry has evolved before I get into specifics. So prior to independence, all coal mines in India were owned primarily by British managing agencies. But after independence, they gradually transitioned to Indian private owners. And private ownership of coal mines was pretty problematic. The Indian planning establishment had very ambitious goals for coal production, which weren't being met by private production. And so in the early 1970s, Indira Gandhi decided to nationalize the industry. And part of it was being underproductive, but part of it also had to do with the way these guys were going about mining. The majority of companies were doing kind of slaughter mining, not using technology, not scaling up. There was a lot of coal between mines which was being lost. And most importantly, like labor standards were violated pretty heavily. And so nationalization was not only kind of trying to scale up production in the industry, but it was also meant to kind of pull up the industry as kind of an exemplar of labor standards. Now, that didn't necessarily happen, but that was kind of the bigger vision at the time. So Coal India is formed in the early 1970s. And as a public sector monopoly, it naturally has a better ability to procure new technology than, 400 or 500 smaller mining companies would have. And so this is when a lot of international cooperation in the Indian coal industry really takes off, primarily with Polish and Russian collaboration, which I'll talk about a little later on. The big break point in kind of India's coal industry in kind of recent memory is 1991, right? Where India's big liberalization moment, it has a balance of payments crisis. And among the conditionalities that are imposed because of the IMF loans at the time are that you can't subsidize your state-owned enterprises through the budget anymore. And so overnight, basically, Coal India has to, for 20 years, Coal India has basically gotten budgetary subsidies annually for its capital expenditure. Now it has to raise that money internally, and it doesn't have it. What happens? Within 3-4 years, the company is in really bad financial shape, and actually the World Bank steps in to save Coal India. Now, this is something the World Bank would probably not like to acknowledge today, but at the time, they basically gave a consolidated between 2 or 3 different projects, almost $800 million in loans to restructure Coal India, get new technology. And it includes a lot of conditions, but for 5-6 years between 1995 and about 2001, the World Bank was hugely involved in helping reshape the Indian coal industry. And so kind of the logical end to this financial progress story is in 2009, where Coal India is actually financially stable enough and attractive enough as a company to have an IPO. And at the time, for like 2 days, it was the most valued company in India by market capitalization. Then the price crashed very quickly. But that gives you a scale of how big the company was. So in terms of production, and these are the various regional subsidiaries of Coal India, you can see that, not all of you know Indian states, but basically the bottom 3 segments, which are kind of the blue, the red, and the green, are Bharat Coking Coal, Central Coalfields, and Eastern Coalfields Limited, which correspond to West Bengal and Jharkhand as states. And you can see that over the last 40 years, those 3 states have stayed more or less stagnant, right? So coal production from those 3 states has stayed the same. And then the other central states have provided the majority of coal growth in India. And I'll show this spatially in a little bit as well. In terms of kind of broad trends, and this trend is mirrored throughout kind of the US and most other coal mining countries as well, there's been a huge trend towards open cast mining. So underground mining, primarily in former British colonies, was very popular, but as kind of explosives technologies and shovels and dumpers and other kinds of mechanized modes of mining evolved, open cast mining actually became much, much more economical. And so 95% of India's mining today, even more than that, is done through open cast mines or pit mines. In terms of who's producing how much coal, as I said before, the public sector, state-owned enterprises produce the vast majority of India's coal. And this is not changing anytime soon. I mean, there have been auctions, coal blocks have been, given for captive mining, but they're really on the margin of production in terms of kind of domestic production of coal. So just to give you a sense of spatially how much coal mining has changed. So this is 1965 coal production in India. You can see it's concentrated primarily among West Bengal and Jharkhand, right? There's like 2 or 3 districts which dominate coal production. Now, fast forward 40 years in 2007, and you can see how the production mean center has moved massively southwest. And so now the majority of coal in India actually comes from Orissa, Chhattisgarh, and Madhya Pradesh rather than West Bengal and Jharkhand. So there's kind of a huge spatial shift, and that's kind of affected coal politics and other things as well. In terms of employment, you can see that Coal India started out employing a lot of people. At one time, it probably employed around like 650,000, maybe even 700,000 people. Their kind of employment records were a bit shifty at the time. That dip is an artifact, please ignore that. But what you can see is essentially employment grew until the liberalization moment. And after liberalization, a bunch of measures were taken to try to reduce excess employment in Coal India through voluntary retirement schemes, through 5 to 10 years of just not hiring new people. There were a lot of kind of methods put in place. And a lot of this was enforced by the World Bank, just trying to make the company more financially efficient. The reason for so much employment wasn't necessarily kind of, some kind of labor efficiency motive. The reason was that Coal India, at least in the 20-year period between 1971 and 1991, played a huge welfare role as well. And so employing so many people was actually one form of redistribution. And anyone who's been to kind of the hinterland of Eastern India and the mining belt has seen that like coal employment is actually a huge part of kind of the local economies in these regions, especially in places like Bokaro, Dhanbad, Asansol. And so basically what you can see is that the majority of employment has actually been shed in the 3 eastern subsidiaries, which were also the ones which are stagnant in production. And so like the political economy of coal in West Bengal and Jharkhand is actually quite different from how it plays out in some of the other central states, which are far more labor efficient and far more mechanized. So why should we care about any of this? This is the reason most people care about this, especially in kind of DC, which is that coal provides between 60 and 70% of all of India's power production, depending on kind of when you're taking the figures. What you can also see is that, other fuels make a very small dent in this, right? So if you want to think about renewable energy enthusiasm, well, India can build 175 gigawatts, but if it's only 10% capacity utilization, that's a very small chunk of the entire power generation mix. As you can see, the energy mix isn't changing very quickly. And so this is kind of one of the big reasons that just infrastructure is lumpy. It has a lot of momentum. And changing this very quickly will take some time. And I'll talk about some of the main reasons why a little later on. So this is kind of a basic overview of the industry. Now I'll talk a little bit about kind of the financial and technical changes that have happened in Coal India over time. So the first thing is this, right? And this is kind of a classic story for a lot of state-owned enterprises that prior to 1991, Coal India is more or less breaking even all the time. And this is by design. Coal prices are set so that basically Coal India doesn't lose any money, right? The government is controlling prices. It's also controlling production. The profit motive isn't supremely important. You just want to produce more coal. But from the mid-90s onwards, especially after the World Bank loans kick in, Coal India actually has to finance all of its investment through its own earnings rather than from the central budget. And so then coal prices are actually allowed to float somewhat reasonably. They're not quite market set, but they're not quite, just kind of zero profit set as well. And so you can see that basically in the last 10, 15 years, Coal India has become enormously profitable by comparison, to the point where it's now one of the companies in the Bombay Sensex. And I mean, there's a lot of equity investment that people at least speculatively put into Coal India as foreign equity investors, not just domestically. The interesting thing is that, as you can see, kind of this is the sales cost versus the cost of production and the divergence that happens from the mid-1990s onwards. But the interesting thing about this is if you disaggregate it by technology, underground mining is almost perpetually loss-making, right? It's quite expensive, the labor costs are very high, the relative production is fairly low, and open cast mining is almost the exact opposite. And so this is kind of the classic story of kind of, West Virginia and Kentucky to the Powder River Basin in the US as well, that essentially the kind of economic efficiency of open cast mining and its mechanization, and unfortunately the fact that you don't have to employ as many people, make it far more feasible financially. And so Coal India has moved in that direction as well. And what you see is that if you disaggregate profits by subsidiaries, you can see that the three eastern subsidiaries, which are in blue, Bharat Coking Coal, Central Coalfields, and Eastern Coalfields, are actually where the majority of the losses are being made. The four other subsidiaries are actually relatively profitable by comparison. And so this was partly by design. What happened with the World Bank loans was that when they were given in the mid-1990s, the condition was that Coal India could only give money from these loans to profit-making subsidiaries. So essentially what they did was like cut off the eastern subsidiaries from further investment and did most of their investment in the central subsidiaries. So this is partly an artifact, but it reflects kind of where the increasing profitability of Coal India comes from. So I've mentioned some of these things before, but basically Coal India's adaptation to the withdrawal of budgetary support was it was a big administrative change. And then this happened in a lot of public sector companies, and not all of them survived. But basically, the loans that were given started 26 specific mines, particularly in central India. And after 1991, Coal India has been relatively good at keeping costs low. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So organizationally, Coal India has actually improved a fair amount, and this is something which is not part of like the common narrative. The common narrative, especially in India, is that Coal India is a remarkably inefficient company. They have a monopoly, they've been misusing it for a while, and that's something I'm trying to argue against a little bit, that they've actually improved a lot in the last 20 years. But I think one of the things which is misunderstood is that like while at the top level Coal India may have a monopoly, it actually has a very fertile competitive subcontracting environment. And so a lot of the gains in the last 15, 20 years have come from Coal India basically hiring private subcontractors to do mining for them. And so over 65% of all coal production in India is not done necessarily by Coal India or its employees, but by people who are managed by Coal India as well. So Coal India is not only a mining company, but it's also kind of a mine management company of sorts. So it's kind of domestic dynamics have changed a lot. And this started primarily with overburden removal, which is kind of the stuff on top of the coal seams, but gradually it's moved towards kind of actual mining practices as well. And so this is kind of, I mean, if you want to be cynical about it, and this is probably the right way to describe it, this is basically a form of labor arbitrage, where it's cheaper to hire private sector employees than it is to hire permanent government employees with all the benefits associated with it. And this is kind of a trend which has been seen globally. This is not just India specific. And so this is kind of some figures behind it. So departmental production is kind of the term of art used for coal produced within the state-owned enterprise by its own employees, and hired production is through subcontracting. You can see the huge rise in hired production which has happened over the last 10, 11 years. And then finally, one of the things, Coal India is not a high technology company. Coal India is not the most efficient mining company in the world. But the thing that people are proud of there is, damn it, they produce the cheapest coal in the world by calorie. And so, these are some statistics from the BP Statistical Review normalized by kind of calorific value of coal. And you can see that at least domestically, if you don't take into account transportation costs, which are a different story, India actually produces some of the cheapest coal in the world. So technologically, what's happened? Basically, prior to 1970, the majority of India's mines were kind of these British-style manual underground mines with very little mechanization. And they were fairly labor-intensive. They were fairly expensive to scale. And there was this cognitive barrier of like, look, we have no mines which produce more than 1 million tons per year. This is something which people in kind of the coal planning establishment talk about a lot. But after nationalization, kind of India experimented a lot with foreign collaborations. And so within like a 10, 15-year period, you had French, Soviet, Polish, and German experts working in Indian mines, and eventually kind of Soviet collaboration won. Where was the US in all of this? Well, the US took a principled stance that they would not lend money to state-owned enterprises. They only wanted to lend to private companies. So they kind of lost out on the coal game. And so a huge part of India's kind of coal mining or kind of knowledge base today is based on essentially a Soviet and Russian mode of mining. And those collaborations still exist today. But from the mid-90s onwards, after kind of the World Bank loans kicked in, you now have a much more competitive technological environment where you have a lot more international companies bidding for technological contracts, equipment contracts, maintenance contracts, et cetera. And so most of the big international mining firms do have a presence in India, not kind of the Rio Tinto and those kinds, but kind of the mine machinery firms, so the CATs, the Komatsus, Joy Mining, et cetera. And so that's one place where kind of there's been a huge amount of entry because India doesn't manufacture a lot of its own coal mining equipment. But, I mean, for better or for worse, India is locked into open cast mining, and that does seem to be kind of the most efficient way of going about. I mentioned this. So in terms of productivity trends, you can see a clear divergence that kind of a few of the subsidiaries are dominating the growth and productivity in coal in India. And so basically, Mahanadi coalfields and northern coalfields, which are kind of the subsidiaries in Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, are the ones which have kind of reaped the massive technological gains to scale. The other ones have improved, but not as dramatically. And if you look at these output for man shift numbers, these are not impressive if you would compare them to Australia or South Africa. But I mean, Coal India still has a lot of welfare objectives, and it does employ a lot of people. And so, I mean, capital productivity might actually be a better way of measuring this, but that's much more difficult to do. But one of the perennial problems in the coal industry, which has been kind of exacerbated, especially in the last 5-10 years, is the ability of railway transport. So in the last 15, 20 years, India has become better at taking coal out of the ground, but it hasn't become too much better at moving it to where it needs to be, especially as the power plants have moved away from kind of the coal belt to other parts of India, right? So places like Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, historically have not had a huge number of power plants because there's very little coal there. But if that's where kind of plants are being financed, then now you're moving coal across huge distances. And Indian Railways, unfortunately, has not been up to that task. And so one of the kind of inevitable consequences of this is a huge substitution towards road-based transport of coal, which has become very common as a way of like privately exiting the state-owned railway system. This is also exacerbated by the fact that railways in India shares both passenger and freight traffic on the same lines. Something they're trying to rectify perhaps 40 years too late, but that is what it is. And so kind of the big takeaway from all of this that I wanted to give you guys was that while state control remains of the Indian coal industry, a lot of it is privately operated now. So at the ground level, if you go to the mines, the guys who are working there are often private operators. And there is a very fertile subcontracting environment where there are a lot of major private players domestically. So you may not have kind of the Rio Tintos and the BHP Billotons, but you have a fair number of mining companies in India which have come up in the last 15, 20 years in response to kind of the demand for Coal India to have subcontracting. And so, for those people who are kind of very skeptical of state ownership, I think this is actually a good example of an organization which has not been stagnant and has actually improved considerably over time. And so, if it's this efficient and there are these kind of scale economies which exist within the organization, especially in procurement and other things, one of the big suggestions is why don't you break up this company and have multiple companies compete against each other? Well, given that transportation coordination is already a huge problem, you may actually be better off having kind of larger scale coordination between these different subsidiaries. And Indian coal mining may not be near the technological frontier, but kind of the existing model seems to be working for India. A lot of coal is getting where it's supposed to be. Most of the power and industrial demand is being met. There are small blips along the way, but it's not a massive problem except for kind of a few years ago. So this is kind of the historical part of the presentation, right? Which brings me to the more interesting and probably controversial part of the presentation, which is, why I think coal will persist. So the first thing is that, and very few people seem to understand this, that most power plants in India are financed by the Indian government, whether they're run by state-owned enterprises or whether they're run by private companies. Essentially what you had was that, maybe you might remember in the mid-1990s, Enron had tried to set up this big gas plant in India, Dabhol, and it went belly up in a very big way. Because of that signal, most international banks refused to lend to infrastructure projects in India. So India basically didn't have access to international capital. It didn't have a functioning bond market. So where do you get the money from? Well, you take it essentially from depositor money and you put it into infrastructure, right? Which is what a lot of poorer and developing countries do. So essentially, India's entire coal fleet is debt financed by the nationalized banks, which are run by the Ministry of Finance, right? So India's government is the majority shareholder, debt shareholder in some ways, of kind of most of the coal plants in India. And so if you start backing coal plants down, the cash flows associated with them are going to hit the banks very, very hard. And this has already started happening. If you've heard about kind of the non-performing assets problem that India and China both have, this is something which is going to have huge financial impacts. And so, I mean, there are ways to transition away from them, but it isn't turn the coal plants off tomorrow. It's kind of renegotiate the entire power purchase agreement and cash flow structure so that somehow these banks are completely screwed in the process. Johannes and I were having this discussion earlier today about, every 2 weeks, either Tim Buckley in the Financial Times or someone in Forbes or someone in green tech media sees these auction numbers, starts jumping up and down and said, RE is less than C. The moment has arrived. Renewable energy is going to save the world now. And I mean, it's getting there, but it doesn't take into account all the hidden costs of integrating solar energy, right? So no one's talking about integration costs. No one's talking about the intermittency problems. No one's talking about the fact that most of the national solar mission plants which came up in India were given more or less free land, huge amounts of subsidized financing. And so, it's getting there. The prices are dropping precipitously. I imagine it'll happen in the next 5 years. But I don't think it's quite there yet. And there's 5 different studies which have 5 different valuations about kind of where this trend is going. And so coal power is still pretty cheap in India. And this is obviously not taking into account environmental externalities and other things. But, very few people are doing that in the first place. The other thing is that putting up a solar plant is very quick. You can put it up in less than a year. And if that's the case, why develop now when prices are falling so precipitously, right? I mean, the cost curve dynamic is already in shape. Most of this is happening through Chinese panels anyway. And so there is kind of a watch and wait. I don't know. I mean, this is for economists to figure out. But I think there is some logic to watch and wait and seeing if it goes down further. Because you're already seeing Indian power companies having buyer's remorse, buying solar, 3-4 years ago, and now saying, oh, it's half the price. We shouldn't have bought earlier. And then I think one of the other things which I alluded to a little bit to earlier, but I think is underestimated, particularly in India and China because of the sizes of their population, is how many people are actually dependent on the coal industry for at least part of their daily livelihood, if not the entirety of it. So while Coal India may employ around 500,000 people, my guess, and I'm formalizing estimates of this a little bit, is that over 20 million people are supported indirectly or directly by the coal industry. And this isn't just financially. This is also Coal India setting up housing for over 1 million people, supplying water to over 1 million households, providing power to whole villages which exist in the coal belt. And this is partly a legacy of kind of the welfare state which happened pre-liberalization, but a lot of these social constructs still exist. And, you need to figure out a transition strategy for those people because, especially in India, kind of losers tend to vote against incumbents. And so whether there's some kind of financial or political kind of resolution to this problem, there is a large vested interest in keeping this industry going, which should not be ignored, I think. And it's mostly concentrated in eastern India, obviously. A huge amount of solar capacity has been built in India. There's no doubt about that. But I think if you look at the percentage of energy generated, it's still hovering around 5-6%, and it's been that way for the last 5 years. What this tells me is that coal plants are being built, and they're actually generating about just as much power as renewable energy is, if not more. And so, kind of that energy mix, again, is not changing drastically. It may in the next 4 or 5 years, but, as I said, 175 gigawatts at 10% capacity utilization. You need something like 70 gigawatts of coal to produce the same amount of power. And so this is going to change slowly. This is not happening quickly. And then finally, there is kind of a regional political economy question here, which is that all of the coal is in eastern India, right? It's eastern and central India. All of the renewable capacity, which is kind of the red parts in both graph maps, is in western or southern India. And so there's a huge spatial mismatch in kind of where the gains from renewable energy are going to come from in terms of probably manufacturing, in terms of deployment. And this is all grid connected. I'm not talking about kind of the rooftop solar or the decentralized stuff, but this is where most of the money is being spent. And so eastern India is already the poorest part of India. And now you want to take away the coal industry. What implications does that have? I think that'll have major political implications if it's not managed in the right way. And I think the perceived injustice of hasty energy transitions has affected both the US and German politics in the last few years. And so this would happen on a bigger scale in both India and China. So backing things down is going to take a lot more political will than I think people are imagining in all this enthusiasm. So I'll stop there. I'm sure I've said some things which people disagree with very strongly. And so basically, energy transitions require time, consensus building, and institutional changes, all of which take a lot of time. And so, strap down and wait for the renewable revolution. It might take a while. Thank you, everyone, and I'm happy to field any questions.
Privilege and prerogative as the chair to ask the first question. One thing I thought was very interesting about your presentation was this technological improvement adaptation over time. Do you see scope and potential for coal India to kind of respond to this increasing competition from renewables, maybe even gas in the future, by pushing the technological frontier further?
Of coal or just generally?
Coal.
Okay. So it's interesting. So there's two things which are happening with Coal India, which I think are show this adaptive ability even further. So the first is that, and this is not necessarily Coal India's choice, but more kind of strong arming by the central government. Coal India built up considerable cash reserves over the last 15 years. And especially when Piyush Goyal was the energy minister, but even now, a lot of that money is being used to put it into building solar plants. This is something which, again, I don't think is in Coal India's core interest, but because it's majority owned by the government of India, if the government of India wants to rate it for its cash, it's welcome to, given it goes through all the board procedures and everything. So that's one thing which is happening. But the other thing which Coal India is doing, which is interesting, is they're not pushing the technological frontier in coal, but they are starting to diversify to other kinds of mining because they see the writing on the wall. I think, the coal industry in India, the way things are going, will probably plateau production sometime in the next 15 years, right? 15, 20 years. And if that happens, the company needs to start changing now. And mining expertise is somewhat laterally movable across different minerals. So I think that's something they're trying to do, which may signal kind of this adaptive ability a little further.
Thank you very much for the talk. It struck me that it fits very nicely with the Suman Berry report on the overall energy equation. But I heard one thing, I didn't hear one thing, I was wondering about things.
Sure.
What I heard was India makes very little mining equipment. With a focus on making in India, you wondered if somebody would use the strength of Coal India, especially if other countries mine less, to force the big international manufacturers to set up production facilities in India. The thing that I didn't hear is the other thing that everybody knows about the coal industry in India is that it is, they say money is the mother's milk of politics, and that the mafias that control the who are your subcontractors and so forth, are very important in supporting, I don't see Milan Vaishnav here.
Yeah.
That sort of fits him.
Absolutely.
The third thing is obviously, the great insight here, which other people haven't emphasized, is the geopolitical economy of Eastern India. But you wonder if, first place, it might not have possibilities for alternative energy sources if somebody would let it. And secondly, whether you can think more generally of how you could use coal, especially if it's going to be phased out, same thing as the petroleum in the Gulf, to start a development thrust.
Okay, yeah. So mine machinery, I think I may have given a bit of the wrong impression. A lot of the CATs and Komatsus and all have set up factories in India. So in some senses, I think that has started already, mainly through joint ventures. I think none of these companies are confident enough or have enough kind of local expertise to do manufacturing in an Indian context without working with Tata or some of these other companies. But that has actually started happening. So, I mean, there's kind of a mix of foreign equipment being brought in and stuff being manufactured domestically. Plus, I mean, the state-owned enterprise that does this kind of heavy machinery manufacturing, BEML, Bharat Earth Movers Limited, is not horrible. It's not great, but it's profitable. So I hope that answers that. In terms of the mafias, yeah, it's something like I have one line on theft because I know this is going to come up eventually. But, theft and leakage is kind of part of the social contract that exists in a lot of coal-bearing areas. And I've talked to almost every, former chairman of Coal India. And it's a kind of cost of doing business, right? Now, at what scale it happens, I mean, there's a million ways to steal coal in India, and some of it is kind of local welfare distribution, and some of it is like organized crime. I think the organized crime stuff has been addressed relatively well over the last 10, 15 years. The kind of local welfare stuff is just like, you have to let that happen. That's something which, if there's 2-3% leakage, so be it. And so, I'm not too worried about kind of the mafia and theft story. It does cause, adverse local consequences in a lot of these areas. But, that's almost kind of the political equilibrium they've reached. And unless the politics changes, I don't see that changing anytime soon. So manufacturing, mafias, and then kind of regional political economy. I think the one big hope for Eastern India, I think, is that between kind of transmission infrastructure and gas infrastructure, at least the stated goals of the Indian government right now are fairly ambitious for expanding access to energy resources which aren't coal in Eastern India. And so, I mean, there are ways of using coal for its hydrocarbons which don't require as much combustion or combustion at all, which, I mean, that's a technology which isn't viable right now, but it's something to consider. But I think in kind of a long term, that is kind of the transition they're eyeing. Again, maybe later in my lifetime I'll see that, but I'm skeptical. Ray?
Thank you, Rohit. So could you comment on a little bit the environmental and utilization and relevant to safety regulations? Does it play a big role here?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, something I strategically avoid because I know it's going to come up in Q&A. So I think there's two major health consequences of coal. So there's obviously kind of the air pollution, kind of the big picture. And then there's all the kind of local effects of coal dust and kind of water sources being affected by coal runoff and these kinds of things. In some senses, this will definitely be controversial, but I think the macro impact, okay, let me put it this way. Air pollution from coal plants is not insignificant in India. I mean, that's not what I'm claiming. I think air pollution in general is a fairly low salience topic in Indian politics. And so other than Delhi and a few places where you have enough middle-class activism to start talking about these things, if you don't have functioning primary healthcare centers, 3 years off the end of your life because, in aggregate, because there's air pollution is not the most important thing that politicians or public health officials are worrying about. It's not like they don't know about these things. There's 100 different studies about value of statistical life calculations, but it's not being communicated in the right way, right? Or it's not being made salient to the people who are making these decisions. And so I think there's, for example, the big IIT Kanpur study on air pollution in Delhi, especially in the winters, coal-related pollution or industrial pollution is maybe 20% of the overall. There's dust from construction, there's vehicular emissions, there's all the crop burning. And so, I mean, kind of, at least on that side, I think the biggest problems from air pollution are not from coal emissions. They're from, using biomass at home and what it's affecting, rural India as they're burning that in enclosed spaces. And so I think that, this is being reflected in the current government's policy, at least, where they're moving in the right direction, but it's happening slowly. They have emissions norms at power plants, but they just delayed it by a few years because the power plants haven't managed to procure all the equipment in time. And so it's something which is a problem, but I'm not sure it's being moved on fast enough because it's not politically relevant yet. And if someone could figure out a great method of coming up with, a form of public communication which tells people, look, you're not valuing this enough, maybe you'll have a job in Indian politics, but it hasn't happened yet, especially outside of urban India. I hope that answers your question. Yes, sir.
How much is imported coal?
So historically, especially like 5-7 years ago, India was importing maybe a sixth to a fifth of all of its coal. But especially in the last 3-4 years, it's ramped up domestic production considerably. And so there is an effort to wean India off of imported coal. That being said, power plants are spec'd to certain kinds of coal. And so the private plants on the coast, which are spec'd to Indonesian coal, are still using Indonesian coal. But the quantum being imported has actually gone down a fair amount as all the state-owned plants have basically committed to not using. So India's fairly, not completely, but fairly self-sufficient in coal resources, I would say.
Where are the countries they're importing from?
Primarily Indonesia, South Africa, and Australia. I think in that order.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, you talked about competition versus renewables, but also versus other types of mining carbons. Obviously, India has kind of a lot of domestic resources, but competition from imports of LNG or tax pipeline or something like that.
So, I think one of the, all of that is fairly expensive right now. Most gas pricing in India is, first of all, it's kind of administratively set, so it's relatively high. India's own gas production from like KGD6 and a few of these other places is relatively expensive. LNG terminals, all of these things tend to up the price of gas as well. And so gas on the whole, the story of gas in India, at least in the last 10 years, especially after kind of the huge boom in the late 2000s, has been fairly disappointing. It has a lot of potential, and especially after India constructs like a national gas grid properly, which is kind of in the works right now, I think that has a lot more potential. But so far, it's, between the RE and coal competition, like gas is hovering somewhere up here at the moment. I think the biggest hope is not for gas to be used as power, but more in like city gas distribution and kind of in kind of domestic uses, as LPG tends to be used today. So far, kind of that's my assessment. That might change. India still has a lot of stranded gas capacities. They built the plants and then the gas wasn't there or it was too expensive. And so I think the private sector's investment in gas is still recovering from that one bad incident. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Would you be able to elaborate at all on how the competition among the mining contractors works, like what the bid factors are, if they have contracts to certain time periods, how the actual competition.
So, I must admit, I haven't studied this too closely, but there is a tendering process. A lot of local companies tend to bid on them. There's both technical and financial bid parameters. I probably have a sample somewhere in my research. But it's extremely locally contested, is what I would say. That like each state has 5 or 6 big kind of mining operators which tend to dominate the scene. And a lot of these are former kind of construction companies who have heavy capital and the ability to invest in them. In such machinery. There have been some competitive concerns when, like, if there's too few players, then kind of can it be rigged? But for the most part, I think Coal India has managed to keep the bids reasonable. I don't know too much more beyond that. I know more of the politics than kind of the details of the bidding. And a lot of the biggest contracts are called kind of heavy earth-moving machinery contracts. And those are usually given for kind of 5-7 year periods and then renewed later on. So the life of a mine is usually 20, 30 years. So it's not given for the entire life of the mine. It's kind of renewed on a kind of quarter of life of mine basis, something like that. Back there?
My understanding that there's been some university research in India at various universities on carbon capture and sequestration kind of accompanying this future of coal. And I was wondering about the level of government interest and private sector interest in that area.
So, yeah, carbon capture and sequestration is like a purely theoretical exercise at this point, unfortunately. I think there are a few private companies which are kind of trying to stake a claim in this space, but the only way they get money is through like government projects and subsidization, right? CCS is one of those weird things where I feel like there isn't enough money floating around, and like so far, no one in the Indian government doesn't want to move first on this. Like it has neither the financial capacity nor the interest in the short term to do it. So, yeah, there's one big private company in India which has been trying to do this. You can probably look them up. They're kind of the only company which ever talks about this, but they've been talking about it for a while. I haven't seen a project. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't say anything optimistic or good about that. Mirsha?
So I'm definitely on your side on this. Great talk, but I want to ask a devil's advocate question.
Uh-oh.
I think you mentioned production plateauing in 15 years.
Yeah, roughly.
We could talk more about that. I think for a policy audience, that seems an impossibly long time, but for say a historian, it's immediately very soon. Are the increases of production, and especially in central India that you've observed, are those a one-off that are based on a certain combination of factors, whether it's the World Bank investment or maybe those areas were a little bit behind some unexploited resources that were there for the taking, and that's going to hit some sort of roadblock?
Yeah, so the plateau is definitely not technical. So I mean, I don't think there's enough coal reserves in India, enough mining capacity that it could go on for the next 100 years if it wanted to. I think that it's going to come on the demand side, where like not enough coal plants are being built, so not enough coal is needed, and so you just won't mine at the same rate anymore, or you won't open new mines. I mean, India opens and closes probably 4 to 5 mines every year. I'm assuming that might slow down depending on how domestic demand. And because India's coal is not of great quality, it's not really exportable, so there's never going to be an international market. Like it's going to stay in the country, and if the country decides that in the next 10, 15 years we're moving away from coal. I think one of the interesting regional trends is that, and you'll be interested in this, that like labor activism is much less common in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh and Orissa than it has been in Jharkhand and West Bengal. And there's various historical reasons for it, and we've talked about this before, but kind of part of the reason it's so productive is because they don't have to hire so many people, because local resistance is not nearly as well organized, because there isn't a history of unionization. Yeah, exactly. And so there's kind of the social contract is very different with kind of the political class and these state-owned companies, which makes it interesting. Yes, sir.
I think of CCS like fusion, it's always 25 years.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree.
But my first question is sort of, maybe it's like down in the weeds, but since coal is such a high percentage of India, is coal actually used for load following, the instantaneous load following, which is unusual pretty much everywhere else? Coal would be based on. So the answer is yes to that, and maybe that affects the next question, which is there some thought about something that the West is seeing, which is renewable heating base load power plants? And since you're not in heads, maybe you could describe what the issue is. And
Right.
So
So
are they aware? Because at the moment, right now, I guess the renewables numbers are like 3% or something like
Yeah.
that. But at the moment they cross over 10, 15%
Yeah.
in any locality,
Yeah.
they won't have to worry about shutting down plants until economics dies.
Right. So I mean, in terms of load following, I think coal plants are definitely involved in load following, but I think that it's slowly being weaned away. My sense is that between hydro gas, kind of the few more flexible sources there are, the thing is it's super regionally concentrated. So I think even from like region to region, it varies a lot. In terms of base load versus kind of peaking, so India kind of has merit order dispatch, but not exactly. And given the current government's certain distribution companies in India are super bullish about renewables, so they have been kind of according renewables must-run status, which sometimes kind of makes them de facto base load. I mean, it's a complicated relationship. We were just talking about this in a workshop earlier this afternoon about how some European countries have actually managed to cycle coal plants enough to have them kind of do peaking and load following rather than be base load plants. I don't think India's plants are anywhere near there yet. So the short answer is that yes, coal remains base load in India. It's being challenged a little bit, but like the volume isn't enough for it to make a huge dent. The dent is being made on kind of the financial side right now, not so much kind of operationally. The biggest problem in India is that like every load dispatch center kind of has a mind of its own, and merit order dispatch is kind of it's suggested but not required. And so given kind of long-term power purchase agreements and kind of local political pressure and other preferences, like what emerges is not always super clear and the data isn't always public. So, and this is something which there needs to be a huge amount of research on, but I don't totally understand that beast. It's still a black box for me. I hope that's somewhat useful.
I was hoping you'd address, let's say, at least a little bit more about, I mean, as the penetration, I mean, you are talking about renewables having priority, you say, out of order.
Right.
And the issue is all of a sudden your baseload power plants don't have any revenue hours because during the peak power price time, midday, whatever, all of a sudden renewables start flooding in, costs, the revenue disappears, and then plants that you want to run 24/7, 365 no longer have enough revenue, which is why in the West these plants are being priced out. I mean, nuclear and coal in this country aren't disappearing because they're bad, it's because they have no revenue,
So-
because the plants are
Right. So I think some of this assumes there's like some form of real-time pricing, which I mean in India is not the case right now. So I mean I understand what you're saying, but I think some of those concerns, like all of this is based on kind of power purchase agreements, and as long as you have some kind of minimum utilization, most of the coal plants will still make money. There is no day-ahead market. Real-time pricing doesn't exist in India. A lot of this is administratively set by regulators. And so it's like you have to think of this like pre-standard market design. Yeah. I think that's closer to being the real model than kind of, Bill Hogan's one of my advisors and kind of the Hogan-esque model of the world. Back there.
Can you comment a little bit on the decrease in the capacity utilization factor of the coal plants, number one, and the relationship of the decrease towards below 50 from over 70
Yeah.
to the economics as was just asked.
Right.
And the second factor related to almost no report of any large new coal-based power generation investment over the last 5 years, and the combination of that leading to the hope by many that the coal sector-based emissions have peaked in India.
Okay. So in terms of capacity utilization, it has been a problem. And I mean, this has to be put in context, right? So India was very good at building coal plants from like 2000 to about 2009-10, right? And it probably built too many of them. I mean, this is a kind of classic infrastructure cycle. Money's coming in, so you build it, the way the planning system works. And so I think part of the reason there hasn't been a huge amount of investment in coal power generation in the last 4 or 5 years isn't the competition. It's just that structurally we had too much for a little while. And I mean, it's not that there isn't demand, it's just the distribution companies can't buy it, right? They're too bankrupt, they don't have enough money, all of these things. Kind of the transmission infrastructure and distribution infrastructure is lacking. I think the dip in capacity factors, especially in the last year or so, it's going to rebound. It's mostly a demand factor, not a competition factor. So because of the bankruptcy of the distribution companies, they'd rather not dispatch power than buy power and then not be able to pay for it. And I mean, frankly, they did very little to alleviate that. So I think that is more of an artifact. I don't think that's kind of a secular trend which is going to happen over time. What was the second part of your question? Sorry.
The linkage between lack of investment,
Yeah.
low capacity factor, and the fact that the emissions from the power sector have peaked.
Yeah, I don't believe that at all. I think that India will probably build more coal plants over the next 5-10 years until kind of the renewable economics is thoroughly in one direction. Like companies like NTPC aren't just going to disappear. And the pipeline is actually fairly big. So if you look at a lot of the coal trackers, I mean, there are coal plants in the pipeline. A lot of them haven't been approved simply because of kind of these demand conditions and everything. But there are definitely a few public sector power plants which are being constructed right now. So yeah, coal emissions from India have not peaked. I'm 90% sure of that. Back there.
Thank you. I'd like to ask, earlier you talked about the basically like the lack of a widespread communications campaign around the coal industry and its reputation being very
Not coal, but air pollution more broadly. Yeah, yeah.
sorry. And then also kind of the outstanding reputation of coal India as being bureaucratic and efficient monopoly, even though that's changing. Can you contrast that at all? Have other industries had similar experiences with just kind of a lot of inertia in their public profile? Or have you seen that
I mean,
vis-a-vis to other industries?
yeah, yeah. I think the public profile thing is partly state-owned enterprises are not very good at PR. It's just they haven't had to do it, right? Like most of these companies have not been public. They've been state-owned. They've had domestic kind of internal incentives, not external ones. And so until 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, Coal India really didn't care what the rest of the world thought of it, right? But after going public, that changes things considerably, right? I mean, everyone's reading articles about you. Everyone's looking into things. People like the Children's Investment Fund pop up and like act as activist investors and like try to force your hand on certain things. And so I think going public has been good for Indian state-owned enterprises simply because their public accountability, at least in terms of, you know, most people know the bad parts of coal emissions at this point, right? Not that Coal India is advertising them, but like there's enough research happening on this. Most people don't know about these welfare effects because at least until 2-3 years ago, Coal India wasn't advertising any of this stuff. And they should because they have been providing kind of welfare services as well as doing coal mining. And that's not an inconsiderable part of their operation. I think there's very few industries which you can compare well to Coal India because of its spatial spread. I think the only one you could really compare is Indian Railways, but they don't have kind of, things are moving through, right? They don't have kind of fixed investments the same way and kind of the localized. So yeah, I'm not sure I can compare it to too many other companies, but I think thinking about public sector companies more broadly is kind of one way of trying to understand like how has the PR machine within these companies evolved over the last 5, 10, 15 years and how has that affected public accountability? Like for example, Coal India, now that it's listed, I mean, everyone who replicates the Sensex by default has shares in Coal India, right? And you know, disinvestment campaigns have been kind of investigating this and seeing whether they want to kind of get rid of their shares in Coal India. Full disclosure, I've advised some of them. I told them not to, but they did anyway. So.
If you don't mind a quick follow-up, have you seen, since Coal India developed the PR machine, have their contractors also done so since they've taken over so many parts of their operations?
Not really. I think, I mean, the subcontracting thing, like, very few people know about this even within India. I mean, when people think of a public sector company, they think of, oh, it's entirely permanent employment. They're doing all the work themselves. Like, a lot of this is kind of the reform by stealth stuff that's happened in India, where like over time companies have changed their practices but have managed to kind of maintain this image of kind of being entirely state-owned and permanent employed and kind of model employer and all of these things. So yeah, I don't think that reputation has caught up yet. Yes, sir.
How much of the coal is used in power plants versus other uses?
75, 80% is used in power, and then some of the other stuff is used as like feedstocks in industrial and steel manufacturing.
I'm particularly interested in the outsourcing model of the company.
Right.
Is that common in other companies, state-owned companies in India?
Yeah, so especially since liberalization, it's one of the things where like it's too expensive for you to get your own labor to do work. I think this is like a classic problem which a lot of developing countries which have state-owned enterprises and are trying to transition towards markets have faced. And so subcontracting is not uncommon, right? I mean, like this is what DC runs on. But like subcontracting while managing the labor politics is kind of the main problem. And I think that's something which, it's not like unions have not opposed these measures. They're just not very powerful, and they've gotten gains for their employees, so they're not kind of looking at the bigger picture all the time.
With the labor reform stagnant here, do you think the outsourcing model is one more used across India for industry?
Oh yeah, it's used. I mean, most state-owned enterprises are outsourcing at this point. Like, NTPC often has like privately trained operators running some of its plants and doing a lot of the work. This is fairly common. It's I think industries which tend to have more employees, they have more bargaining power. So for example, in banking, this is much less likely just because like banking unions are huge, right? In India, there's a lot of clerks and stuff which would object to this. I think coal is more localized, and kind of the local politics has been managed better by the central government and by Coal India. And so despite opposition, backdoor privatization is fairly common.
For a gigawatt coal plant, you're talking about something like 100 carloads of coal a day.
Right.
Going to do it.
Yeah.
And probably coal in India is probably 150 carloads.
Yeah, low quality, right.
Quality difference. The alternative to shipping coal is putting it on transmission lines.
Yeah, coal by wire, right.
And one would think that transmission lines for a geographically complex place like India would be popular. So my question is, people like transmission lines because it keeps coal off the rail and it lets you pretty much get anywhere.
Right, no, absolutely, I agree.
And to go with that, one would think that that means you can actually localize
Your production,
the
power production, right,
and
yeah.
the power plant, put it all in one area. As long as one area likes it, then the
No,
rest
so,
of the,
I mean, no one likes it, let's be honest, but
people who like it in the sense of people
employment and
employed in
yeah,
buildings,
yeah. I don't know if I agree with that analogy, but fair enough. No, I think, so India's initial power planning, especially in kind of the 70s and 80s, the big NTPC plants were all pithead plants. So that was kind of the model. I think what kind of messed it up a little bit was, first, as the private sector entered, they were much less wedded to Eastern India, and especially operating there because the political environment is much more difficult. But the second thing was that India had this weird policy of freight equalization, where essentially, regardless of how far you were taking freight, it would cost the same amount. And you can understand there was a logic behind it of like, resources should be able to move to any part of the country without being too expensive, right? Like, this is kind of a classic socialist model. When they got rid of that, then all of these legacy plants, which were built under kind of the assumptions of a postal rate for transporting coal and all of these things, changed a lot. And so there's a lot of like very idiosyncratic factors which led to, power plant siting is a very political activity, right? People would like to think that it's like techno-economic, but like ultimately people lobby to have plants. And Western and Southern India had better political environments, and frankly, better lobbyists. So that's part of the reason kind of they were so spread out. But I think this logic is coming back. I think a lot more plants are being built in much closer to mines than they have in the last maybe 10, 15 years. Okay, well, I guess I've stumped the audience. So thank you so much, everyone. I thank you for being here. And yeah, please email me if you have any questions, or I'm available after the talk. Thank you.
The power plants are the same as everywhere else, the same